Well, welcome to the show, Dr. Gavin Francis. I'm so glad that you're here.
Oh, thank you for having me along.
Absolutely. And we're here to talk about your new book, Convalescence, the Lost Recovery, the Lost Art of Convalescence. Before we get into all of that, can you talk about the main events in your life, specifically your childhood, that led you to focus on this and this really crucial, important part of healing?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I grew up in Scotland near Edinburgh, and I describe quite near the beginning of this book two contrasting experiences of recovery I had very early on. And one was when I had an accident off a bicycle, which broke a bone in my leg, broke my tibial plateau, and I had my leg immobilized for a couple of months, and then I described the slow recovery from that, rebuilding the balance and the strength in that leg. And also, as a child, I suffered from meningitis, and that gave a very different experience of recovery in the sense that meningitis was exhausting. I had a lot of fatigue afterwards, headaches. There was a kind of slow recovery from that, which was very different in nature from the one where I was watching my leg slowly build up health and strength again. And so I used those two stories early on in the book to try and make the point that I'm very aware, both from personal experience and from my work as a physician, that recovery takes many different forms with different people. With many, it's unique, really, both to the individual and to the condition that you're recovering from. But there are some general principles, I think, that we can draw out that can be useful in lots of different situations.
Yeah. And I love how you talk about the impact of culture in healing and how different it could be in the United States versus Asia, and how culture really does impact our our thinking around healing, our expectations around healing. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So it's something that I've become increasingly aware of. I wasn't so aware of when I was still at medical school, but then gradually as I began to practice first in emergency medicine and then as a primary care physician, I started to realize very much that illness is as much about culture, really, as it is about disease, in the sense that we fall ill in patterns that we almost expect to, and our expectations of the body also influence the way we recover as well as the way we fall ill. And there's lots of different examples of that, different kind of cultural conditions which afflict certain kinds of groups and not others. One of the ones I home in on with regard to the kind of Western European culture that I'm part of is there can be a real lack of self-compassion, and people often drive themselves very hard, try and push themselves back to work before they're really ready to go back to work. And quite a lot of my job as a primary care physician is about reassuring people that they really do need to take time off, that actually in some situations their work is making them unwell or ill or delaying their recovery. And so trying to encourage people to take that permission to give recovery the adequate time and respect that it deserves.
Why do you think we are so reticent to do the healing work, to really dive deep, to let the body do what it needs to do in, Western culture? Do you think it's programmed from birth, or do you think we're all just comparing ourselves to each other more than other cultures?
Yes, I think there's lots of different routes to it. There's often, obviously one of the biggest roots is economic. So
Mhm.
if you don't have a safety net and you're going to lose your income if you're off work, that of course is a huge driver. Connected to that economic factor is what you just alluded to, the kind of competitiveness that people feel that they're letting colleagues down and them letting themselves down if they take a step back. And so there's a real kind of competitive drive to keep ahead, whether it's in your career or whether it's in terms of trying to keep up with your neighbors, in terms of how well you feel you're fulfilling your parenting duties. There's a kind of competitive edge there that people push themselves to. Um, I think those are probably the two main ones that drive us in the West, or that I see among my own patients. Sometimes, if people have got a very good close-knit family, they've got a lot of close family around them that are able to take up some of the slack and help them, that can be really helpful. And so I guess another cultural element is if the family is quite divided and split up geographically, and the people don't have close relatives nearby, and that can be a real difficulty in terms of recovery from illness too.
Right. This period of healing you talk about in the book is so important, not only just to get to where we were before, but I love how you talk about to get to a point of what's possible and to reframe it that way and to look at our lives differently. A moment of injury and illness is really just the beginning of a new journey. Can you speak to that and how we can all, the woman tuning into this can, whether she's experienced illness or not, or someone in her family, how she can begin to reframe how she thinks about healing?
Well, when I was a medical student, they used to teach us this definition of health, which was health is complete social, physical, and mental well-being. And I remember thinking when I was a medical student, I was like, that's ridiculous. Like, that must be almost nobody has complete social, physical, and mental well-being. So what proportion of the global population has actually got health under that definition? And slowly, as I worked and gained more experience as a physician, I realized, well, no, actually, I think that's quite a poor definition. And health to an 18-year-old means something very different from health to a 40-year-old, to a 60-year-old, to an 80-year-old. And that health is much better reframed as a balance between extremes, a bit more of a kind of old-fashioned classical approach to health, but that it means something different for different people and at different stages of your life. And it's much more helpful, rather than having some sort of golden perfection that you're always striving and failing to reach, to think about health in terms of achievable goals and in terms of the possibilities that are open to you. And I quote this wonderful rehabilitation physician, a chap called Christopher Ward, and he works helping people rehabilitate from the most disabling, appalling injuries. And he says that very early on in a therapeutic relationship, he tries to talk to people about this idea of possibilitation rather than rehabilitation. What is going to be possible for you in this new situation that your illness has, or your injury has thrust upon you? How can we get you into the best possible place to live with the least suffering, with the most dignity, with the most autonomy? What is going to be possible, and what can we do to help facilitate that? And I think it's a much more generous, a kind of magnanimous way of thinking about health that I admire. Some of my patients, for example, have incurable illnesses. If you have an incurable illness, I still want to think you can recover in the sense of building towards that life of more dignity, more autonomy, less suffering. We just have to take a different kind of route to it.
And what are some of the best ways to optimize, to approach healing in a strategic way that are going to get you to that place, to be more graceful towards yourself, to be more what you just said to yourself?
Yeah.
I mean, what can we all do? Because we're all gonna, like you said in the book, we're all gonna be patients at some point.
Yeah. Well, I tried to put some summarizing principles into the chapters, examine different aspects. So one aspect is about trying to give recovery and convalescence the respect that it deserves. One is about the environment that we choose to recover in. One is about the different kinds of therapies. We need to expand our mind beyond thinking of therapy as just pills and realize that it can be all sorts of things. Getting a pet can be therapy. Joining a choir can be therapy. Joining a dance class, that kind of thing. And so some principles that I try to set out with patients that are struggling with recovery would be that remember that recovery isn't really passive, that it's an act, and you do it better if you engage with it as an act. And it can also be sometimes an opportunity as well as an imposition. You know, I often find patients that are going through a difficult period of illness and slow recovery find that they reconsider their priorities and reframe their priorities because of that experience, sometimes in a very positive way. I also try and stake a claim, which some of my medical colleagues disagree with, that medicine actually is relatively limited in its power. I mean, modern Western medicine is really good at things like curing infectious illnesses, treating tumors with chemotherapy. It's good at fixing broken bones with titanium screws. But there's lots of different conditions that modern Western medicine isn't particularly good at addressing. And so there are older, more traditional perspectives on recovery from those that I try to elucidate in the book. So don't look to modern Western medicine necessarily for all the cures for everything, because some things it really isn't very good at treating.
I would imagine your peers would bristle a little bit at that, to hear you speak or to read that in your book, because you're trained that doctors know all and are the solution to all of your problems. And if you go anywhere else, well, then you're a fool. So how do you interact then with your peers when they do differ in their opinions on things like this? Because this is huge.
Yeah, I mean, I think most primary care physicians, certainly like most psychiatrists, about a third of my workload is to do with mental health as a primary care physician, and we're aware that a lot of medicine doesn't have quick fixes. This isn't like cardiology where you're just putting in a stent and dissolving cholesterol. It isn't like orthopedic surgery where you're just putting bones back together with screws and bits of metal. This is about life, it's about belief, and it's about expectations, and it's much more messy than those other branches of medicine, but it also can be really much more rewarding and enthralling. And so I find actually that when I have these conversations with my peers, that they do start to say, oh yeah, I know what you mean, or I see what you mean. I think one example is the chapter that I wrote in this book is called The Ideal Doctor, and it stakes out my position, which is that over 30 years in medicine, I've realized that the very best doctors are the ones who can intuit or figure out quite quickly after meeting a patient what kind of approach they should take. Should they take a very kind of distant, objective scientific approach? Should they take a much more touchy-feely kind of gentle approach, soft? Or should they maybe take a kind of collaborative approach where they form an alliance with the patient together to go on a journey together through this illness? The really good physicians, I think, figure out which kind of doctor they need to be to help that particular patient. And when I discuss that with my colleagues, usually they recognize that. They say, oh yeah, I've met people who, you try to adopt a kind of very objective scientific approach and it just doesn't work. And you have to adopt something much more collaborative, or vice versa.
I would imagine too, as a doctor, you're seeing so many patients. After so many years, you would either have to adapt to be like that, or you would get burnt out yourself. Do you find that to be true?
Yeah, I think that the happiest doctors are the ones that stay curious about their fellow human beings, are genuinely interested in hearing about other people's lives, and who manage to hold on to that satisfaction of really caring about what happens. And it's very easy to get burnt out. The pressure of demand sometimes can be quite overwhelming, and it would be too much for anybody. And so I always, when I speak to colleagues as well, I spend quite a lot of time talking about avoiding burnout, like trying to keep your love for the job, trying to keep your enthusiasm and your curiosity about your fellow human beings, which is the way to keep being happy as a clinician.
Yeah. I mean, my sister works in oncology, and she'll tell me stories about trying to help patients, and they'll pass, and it's devastating to her. And I just wonder, how do you as a physician stay strong, stay resilient, stay curious after everything that you've seen and experienced in your work?
Well, I'm a primary care physician, and so the tremendous variety is something that keeps me really satisfied and interested. Because although I've been doing this for a lot of years, um, I still I've never had 2 days the same. So I've never had two
Mm.
days where the same stories come through the door. There's always something different, and every week there's somebody will come with a story or a problem that I've never come across before. And so that keeps me really engaged and curious. Also, my family, I've got 3 young kids. I'm very engaged with them and their lives, and very drawn into um, like all the kind. They're all teenagers now, so all the fascination of that. And yeah, and I spend a lot of time doing kind of outdoor cycling, walking, hiking, that kind of thing. And through those three, family and outdoors and my professional life, I seem to keep my interest and engagement with the work.
Do you find that you're more motivated to have that full bill of health in your own life because of what you see day to day? I mean, I'm sure you see healthy people all the time too, but I would imagine if you're seeing people who are afflicted by disease or some kind of illness, I mean, it would motivate me to like get to the gym, to eat the salad versus the hamburger, things like that.
Mhm. Yeah, there's something I've tried to write about a little bit in this book is the very occasional. I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that they're common, these things, but occasional advantages of illness. And one of those advantages, which is a very tiny silver lining on a big cloud, is that it really helps you to cherish health and wellness when you have it or when you see it in others. And certainly my medical work has given me a really heightened awareness of the preciousness of health. And when I come home from a really busy or difficult day dealing with a lot of complex problems, to chat with my family over dinner, um, it definitely heightens the satisfaction or how rewarding that is if I'm aware of just how fragile health is, how easily things can be taken away from us. And so, if illness has got any positives in our life, then maybe that's one of them, to remind us of the fragility, really, of our wellness and our health, and to help us to cherish it when we have it.
Do you think that that is truly the ultimate lesson, why we as humans have to go through certain periods of downtime, of stillness to learn that lesson?
Well, I wish the universe was as goal directed as that, as to try and teach us lessons. Sometimes I feel it's just, yeah, it's really random, and unfortunately, it's really very difficult when people suffer. Suffering is a terrible thing to have to endure, and it's a terrible thing to see in others, especially when you feel, as so often is, very, very undeserved. But it does, you're quite right, it does heighten the preciousness of it. And our, you mentioned recharging, so stillness helps us recharge. And I think that all human beings need periods of rest and reflection, and convalescence is one way of obliging us to do that. When you're recovering from an illness, you really have to stop for a while. And I've known many patients over the years that lead busy, stressful lives, whether they be executives in big companies or whether they be homemakers with a lot of demands from family. When an illness has actually forced them to stop and kind of reconfigure their priorities, that has ultimately proven to be a helpful change in their life. And it's something they wouldn't have chosen to go through, but I guess that's the great trick in life, isn't it? Is trying to pick up those odd silver linings from the clouds that keep coming over us.
I love that. And I would think too, as a dad, I mean, that's something that you try to impart to your children. are they receptive to this latest book, to your philosophy on life when it comes to healing? I mean, they're so much younger, and like you said, at that age, your idea of health and how life should be is different than when you're older.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I do try and encourage them to have a bit of self-compassion, in terms of if they're not feeling 100%, to say, well, it's fine, not to go and do your, go play hockey or basketball, or it's fine to have a duvet weekend if you're feeling below par. I'm trying to teach them those little lessons of that sometimes a little bit of self-compassion can ultimately help you in the longer run. It makes you feel stronger and better afterwards than just keeping pushing yourself because you feel you ought to do something.
I love that. I love that. Do you think it was you getting meningitis or getting on that bike accident in your childhood that kind of formed the foundation for this philosophy on life? Or do you think it was just being in the medical field for so many years and seeing so many patients and helping them through these periods of convalescence?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I sometimes think back on these childhood experiences and wonder if that's what triggered me to want to be a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
If I'd never been unwell as a child, I would never really have encountered hospitals. And my memory of hospital is very positive. It was a place where I felt the how worthwhile and how useful it was as a job. I felt very safe when I was there, that people knew what they were doing and looking after me and helping me to get better. And that probably did lay a bit of a foundation stone in my idea of wanting to study medicine. This book itself actually grew out of seeing so many patients recovering or struggling to recover from COVID, because I had a lot of patients who were really very fatigued after they had COVID, or they were really very breathless after they had COVID. And I realized I was having similar conversations again and again with these patients, or, they're young and old, they were all sectors of society. And I realized that there were certain principles that I took for granted that they didn't take for granted. And so it was quite helpful for me to distill all those nuggets of wisdom I picked up over the years practicing medicine, put them all in one short, accessible, fairly, compact book. So that was the initial impulse, was realizing just how often I was having to have conversations about principles of convalescence with people in that year through 2021, 2022. Yeah.
Did you find that people really had no understanding of true convalescence, no real way to wrap their heads around it? I mean, is everyone that you meet and that you were talking to who fell ill and wasn't back right where they wanted to be, were they confused? Like, what is going on? What is it? I don't want to stop. I don't understand this. This doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something to do with what you alluded to earlier in terms of our society pushes us to achieve. It's quite a kind of high stress, high turnover, high speed society. There's a lot of expectations come with that. And with that also comes a kind of degree of impatience. And I have had so many conversations with people who've understandably found themselves very impatient at how long it's taking them to recover. We've got kind of used to the idea that modern medicine is really magical and can fix things very, very quickly. And through the 1950s and 1960s, as more and more antibiotics were developed and inhalers were developed and steroids and chemotherapies, and we got more and more used to the idea that modern medicine should have quick fixes for almost anything that goes wrong with us. But my experience has been very different, actually, of practicing medicine, and that the number of conditions that can be quickly and easily cured is actually quite small. And I often have to spend time with my patients trying to encourage them to be a little less impatient, to understand that this can be a slow process of your body gathering strength again. The word convalescence means to grow in strength. That's what its origin is, if you go back into the roots of the word. And it's a lovely way of thinking about that slow process of growing back into health and strength after an illness.
Mm. What changes would you like to see in the medical establishment in the Western world to have a more holistic approach, to think like you so that they can better help their patients? Because like you said, it's not a quick fix.
Yeah, and different places, there's different pressures, isn't there? In the UK, we don't have very much time with our doctors at all. I would love to have more time with my patients to be able to properly explore what their expectations are and get more of an understanding of what their priorities are too. So more time would make a big, big difference. I would also like to see medical schools emphasize a little bit more that they don't have all the answers. I think
Oh.
sometimes they inculcate in medical students this kind of expectation that if you just get a big enough textbook, you can find all the answers. But my experience has been that that isn't the case, actually. And the very best doctors I've worked with have been the ones that recognize that and realize that sometimes the answers don't lie in a book, they lie in a different kind of attitude or developing a different kind of relationship with the patient. The word doctor originally comes from a kind of root meaning guide, and I like that idea, the doctor as a kind of guide to helping you through the landscape of illness. But doctors very rarely have all the answers. Some conditions, they do have all the answers, but for a lot of conditions, we don't have all the answers. And so what I can offer my patients when I don't have all the answers is a kind of companionable guide approach to helping them through a kind of landscape that I've seen other people cross successfully in the past. There's a kind of almost like a terrain of illness that I see often in my work that I might be able to help people through, but I don't know everything about it and I don't have every single answer. Yeah, maybe if we can imbue our medical students with a little bit more humility, that would help.
That's powerful. I think that's a beautiful approach to medicine. And I think when you come into a room and you have that kind of energy, immediately the patient is already doing better, because you're receptive and you're really truly present and listening.
Yeah, no, I've worked with some doctors over the years who are really, really got that kind of charisma, who can really inspire confidence, and also at the same time as inspiring confidence that they know what they're doing, they are open to modifying their approach depending on what the patient needs. And I've tried hard to learn from that when I've got adequate time. Consultations are always so pressed for time.
Right. Well, I think too, we have so many doctors tuning into this show, and there's this sense of that's why you got into the profession, right? It wasn't all ego, it was to help people and to heal people. And there's that desire to do that. And so I think to hear you say that, they're all kind of going like, yeah, exactly. Like we want to do better, we need to do better. But again, it's that little trick of time that we're all pressed against the wall, all of us.
Yeah. And there's something as well that I wanted to try and highlight in this book, which will be very resonant for your listeners, which is to do with caring for the caregivers. So much of our modern medical system allocates people quite short periods of time with their physicians, sort of short, intermittent bursts of contact. And for most people who are in convalescence, the time that they're spending far more time with their caregivers. And how we better support caregivers by acknowledging the stress and the difficulties of caring is something that I think in medicine we could do a lot better with acknowledging. I saw that hugely during the pandemic when a lot of third sector services, a lot of kind of support services for people suffering chronic illness were closed down. And so the stresses on carers and caregivers really increased enormously during that period. And I hope that as we rebuild following the pandemic and rebuild our services, we do it with the needs of those caregivers in mind.
I love that. And we could end on that. But Dr. Francis, if there were anything that you would want to leave with the listener today about your work, about your life, about your thoughts on this important period of healing, what would that be?
I think it would just be that doctors and nurses we're more like gardeners than we are like mechanics. We don't fix broken parts. It's about trying to create the right environment for people best to heal. And so if you're struggling with chronic illness, trying to give that process of healing the respect and the attention that it deserves, to engage with it, and look among your physicians, look for somebody who's going to appreciate that central importance of trying to create the right environment that's going to help you heal the best you can.
I love that. I love that. Well, your patients are extremely lucky to have a doctor like you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show and share your thoughts with my audience. Your wonderful book is out in the world. How can our listeners find you online and get the book?
So the book is published by Penguin Life. It's called Recovery, the Lost Art of Convalescence. There is an audiobook too, which I greatly enjoyed reading myself.
Oh.
And there is, you can read about it on my website. I've got a website, which is just my name, gavinfrancis.com.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. This is great.
Okay, thank you, Liz.